An old woman found a piñata in her garden, and when she broke it, tears welled up in her eyes. Rosaura stepped out into the yard with slow steps, her worn-out sandals lifting a thin layer of dust on the dry earth. The air was heavy with the smell of burnt wood and freshly made tortillas, an aroma that drifted in from the neighboring houses. The town, nestled between green mountains and a cloudless sky, seemed frozen in time. But she had no eyes for the beauty of the landscape. At 85, her body felt every single day she had spent working, bent over the stove or crouched down washing clothes. That morning, while hanging an old sheet on the clothesline, a gust of warm wind made her stop and look toward the mountains. There, on the horizon, were the memories she could not erase. As a child, Rosaura had never left that small town. She grew up in a little adobe house that still stood, though now with deep cracks. Her father, Esteban, was a man with large hands and an authoritarian voice who never wasted time on caresses or kind words. For him, the family existed solely to sustain work. "No one lives here to dream," he said whenever one of the children expressed a wish that had nothing to do with the field or the kitchen. She was the eldest of 6 siblings and the only girl. From the age of 6, her mother, Josefa, had tied her to the household chores. "You are my hands," she told her every morning as she gave her instructions to grind the corn, wash the clothes, or sweep the dirt floor. Her childhood had no games or laughter, only endless days marked by the sound of firewood crackling and the cold water that hurt her hands in the river. Deep down, Rosaura never blamed her mother. She knew she too lived under Esteban's rules, a man who allowed no contradictions. But the weight of that silent life crushed her. While her brothers ran among the corn furrows or played with stones near the river, Rosa dreamed of escaping. In the afternoons, when she managed to steal a few minutes for herself, she listened to radio dramas on the old device her grandfather had left before he died. The stories spoke of women in elegant dresses who lived in cities full of lights. Women who had time to dream and laugh. The girl could not help but wonder why her life was so different. At the age of 10, a conversation she overheard by accident revealed the weight of her destiny. Esteban was talking with a neighbor, an older man with a gray beard, about plans for Rosaura. "She's good in the kitchen, and she's learning to sew quickly. By 15, she'll have everything she needs to be a good wife," her father said, with the same indifference with which he spoke of pigs or chickens. She didn't understand everything at that moment, but she felt a knot in her stomach. That night, while trying to sleep in the corner she shared with her siblings, she cried silently. She wasn't crying for something she had lost, but for something she would never have: freedom. From then on, she learned to hide her emotions, to do as she was told without protest. But inside her, something broke. At 12, Rosaura began to notice that her childhood wasn't like that of other girls. There were few well-off families in the town, but when she saw the shopkeepers' daughters walking with their rag dolls or playing in the fields in clean dresses, she felt a pang of envy. She didn't want their toys or their dresses. What she longed for was their time, the chance to run free without anyone shouting that she had to return to the kitchen. The kitchen, that dark and smoky place, was the center of her existence. There she learned to make perfect tortillas before she knew how to read. There she burned her hands so many times that she stopped fearing fire. Every corner of that room smelled of corn, onion, and firewood. And though she didn't know it then, she would spend much of her life locked in similar kitchens, sacrificing her days so others could eat. One afternoon, while sweeping the yard with a straw broom, something happened that she would never forget. A brightly colored piñata appeared hanging on the clothesline where her mother dried the laundry. It was something completely out of place, an object so strange and beautiful that for a moment she thought she was dreaming. "Who left it here?" she asked aloud, but no one answered. The piñata was a sun with paper rays of all colors swaying in the wind. Rosaura stood staring at it with her heart beating fast. She had never seen one so close. In the town, only rich children had parties with piñatas, and her family had never had enough to afford one. That night, she asked her mother about the piñata. Josefa shrugged. Maybe someone left it by mistake. It's not for us, she said dismissively. But Rosaura couldn't get it out of her mind. For days, she looked at it from the window while she did her chores. It was as if that object were speaking to her, reminding her of everything she had lost. The day her father decided to use the clothesline for drying clothes and to get rid of the piñata, she felt a mix of rage and resignation. She didn't dare protest, but as she watched Esteban unhook it and throw it into the fire, something inside her broke again. At that moment, she understood that her childhood was not coming back. The piñata, with all its colors, had been consumed in the fire like her dreams. Rosaura stopped dreaming after that. If she ever had, the desire remained buried among the ashes. That afternoon, while the smoke of the piñata floated in the air, she finished sweeping the yard in silence. The sun was beginning to hide behind the mountains, covering the town in an orange light. From afar, the cornfields seemed to call her, but she knew there was no escape. The mountains, always present, were as tall as the barriers of her life. Only a few years passed before the girl, excited by a piñata, forgot any reason left to dream. That afternoon, the woman sat on a wooden bench in front of the wood stove, watching as the tortillas began to puff up on the griddle. Her mother, Josefa, stirred a thick broth that boiled in a pot, blackened by use. The conversation that afternoon was like any other, until Esteban, her father, entered the room with his deep, sharp voice, dropping his words like a hammer. I already spoke with Don Hilario. Jacinto will come to ask for you tomorrow, he said without looking at her. Rosaura didn't understand at first. She was barely 15 years old, and the name Jacinto, a man from the town several years older than her, was familiar only because she had seen him a couple of times in the market square. When her eyes searched for her mother for some sign, Josefa simply looked away, plunging the ladle into the broth as if she hadn't heard anything. Ask for me for what? Rosaura asked, though deep down she already knew. To marry you, what else? Her father replied in the dry tone of someone closing a livestock deal. That night, the young girl didn't sleep. Her brothers snored piled together in the small room they shared, but she could only stare at the wooden ceiling, going over again and again what awaited her. It wasn't a surprise, but reality hit her like a closed fist. In the world she had been born into, her future wasn't something she could decide. It didn't matter if she felt fear, sadness, or even rage. None of that had a place in the life that had been assigned to her. The next morning, Jacinto arrived at the house with his mother and father, carrying a sack of corn, 2 hens, and a bunch of wilted flowers. Rosaura watched them from the doorway, her hands pressed against her apron. Jacinto was 10 years older, with sunburnt skin and broad shoulders, like someone used to hard work. When he smiled at her, she turned her gaze away. Esteban and Josefa received the visitors at the main table, where they exchanged greetings and formal words. Rosaura said nothing, not even when her father called her to come closer. This is Jacinto, Esteban told her, as if she didn't know who he was. He's a good man, hard-working. You won't have problems with him. Rosaura lifted her eyes for a moment, and Jacinto was looking at her with a mix of shyness and pride. It will be an honor to take care of her, he said, though his words sounded like a rehearsed formality. The deal was sealed in less than an hour. Jacinto and his family left, promising that the wedding would be in less than 3 months. The young girl stayed in the yard, watching as the hens they had brought pecked at the ground. Now you are a woman, her mother told her later as they cleared the dishes from the meal. But Rosaura didn't feel like a woman. She only felt an enormous emptiness growing in her chest. The preparations for the wedding were quick and simple. Her father made sure everything was ready with the same efficiency with which he organized the planting of the corn. Rosaura didn't even have time to take in what was happening. Josefa sewed a simple white dress, and some neighbors brought flowers to decorate the town's church. Everything was so mechanical that it seemed it wasn't about the life of a person, but just another task in the endless list of duties that defined her existence. On the wedding day, she walked to the altar on her father's arm, with the eyes of the whole town upon her. The church, small and modest, was full of familiar faces. Some women smiled approvingly, while others whispered among themselves. Jacinto awaited her at the end of the aisle, wearing a suit that seemed 2 sizes too big and holding a bouquet of flowers in his hands. "You look beautiful," he said when Rosaura reached his side, but she could barely respond with a gesture. The priest spoke of marriage as a sacred sacrament, as a union that must last a lifetime, but the young girl wasn't listening. Her thoughts were elsewhere, in the dark corner of her mind where she hid her desires and dreams. There, she imagined a different life, one where she could choose, where she could be something more than a wife and a cook. Married life began without surprises. Jacinto, to her fortune, was not a cruel man. On the contrary, he seemed to make an effort to treat her kindly. He always returned from the fields with fruits or sweets to share with her, and often told her she was beautiful, though Rosa never knew if he truly meant it. However, that wasn't enough to fill the emptiness she carried inside. No matter how much he tried to be a good husband, the young woman could not see him as someone to love. To her, he would always be the man her father had chosen, the symbol of everything she had never been able to decide for herself. Routine quickly settled into her life. Mornings began with the sound of birds and the smoke of the firewood, as she prepared breakfast for Jacinto. Then came cleaning, lunch, sewing, dinner. Everything repeated like an endless cycle. Without changes, without emotions. The only distractions were the occasional visits from the neighbors, who came to exchange gossip or ask for some advice about cooking. Time passed, and with it, any hope that her life could change. Rosa became an expert at hiding her sadness. She smiled when it was necessary, politely answered the neighbors' questions, and did everything Jacinto expected of her. But at night, when she was alone in the darkness, her mind returned to those childhood days when she dreamed of a different life. One day, while gathering firewood in the yard, Jacinto approached with a nervous smile. "I was thinking it's time we had a child," he said, as if he were talking about planting a tree or buying a new tool. Rosa looked at him without answering, feeling the pressure in her chest grow stronger. She couldn't imagine bringing a child into a world where there was no love, only duties. But she knew she couldn't refuse. In her world, wives didn't have the right to say no. That night, as she lay down beside the man, she felt how a new stage of her life was beginning. A stage she hadn't asked for, but one she would have to face like everything else, with resignation. The months passed in tense silence. Jacinto insisted on his intentions of becoming a father, convinced that a child would be the solution to any emptiness he felt in his home. The young woman, on the other hand, lived those days as if she carried a heavier burden with each dawn. Her mind drifted while she made tortillas in the kitchen, imagining what the life of a boy or girl born in a home where love was nothing more than a distant rumor would be like. One day, after weeks of morning sickness and overwhelming fatigue, Rosaura realized what was happening. Sitting on a bench under the guava tree in the yard, she felt a mix of emotions she could not define. Deep in her heart, she feared what it would mean to bring a new life into a world where she herself had never been happy. But when her husband returned that afternoon from the fields and she gave him the news, his face lit up in a way Rosaura had never seen before. "We're going to be parents," Jacinto exclaimed, dropping the tool he held in his hands. He embraced her with almost childlike emotion, as if that moment were the only thing that mattered in the world. She allowed the embrace, but her gaze was fixed on the mountains surrounding the town. The pregnancy was not easy. The days grew heavier, and the household chores did not stop. Jacinto tried to help her from time to time, but his efforts were clumsy and often more of a burden than a relief. The young woman said nothing. She simply accepted her fate with the same resignation she had learned since childhood. Weeks passed, and with each movement of the baby in her womb, the young woman felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, she thought, This child could be different. Maybe she could teach him what she herself had never learned: to dream, to seek something beyond the limits of the town. The day of childbirth came with a sudden storm. Rain fell furiously on the tin roof of their house, and Jacinto, nervous, ran to fetch the midwife. She remained in bed, clutching the sheets tightly as the contractions tore through her body. Josefa, her mother, arrived to be with her, her rough hands holding her firmly. "It won't be long now," her mother said, though her tone was more practical than comforting. Hours later, with Rosora's cries drowned out by the rumble of thunder, a baby's wail filled the small room. The midwife lifted the child, a robust baby with dark hair and eyes squeezed shut. "It's a boy," she said with a smile. Jacinto, who had arrived just in time, took the child in his arms with an almost religious reverence. Rosa watched him from the bed, exhausted but strangely serene. "Ezequiel," her husband said firmly. That would be the boy's name. Ezequiel's first months brought an unexpected change to the home. Jacinto was more attentive than ever, waking at night to calm the baby and helping Rosora as best he could. She, though exhausted, found comfort in the small things: the softness of Ezequiel's cheeks, his smile when he heard her voice, the way his tiny hand clung to hers. For the first time, she felt there was something in her life worth protecting. With each passing day, she promised herself that Ezequiel would not grow up with the same chains she had carried all her life. "I will teach you to fly," she whispered in his ear as she rocked him to sleep. However, Jacinto did not entirely share that vision. Though he adored his son, he firmly believed that Ezequiel should follow in the family's footsteps, learn the value of work from a young age, and not be distracted by useless dreams. Rosora never openly argued with him, but inside, each of those words was a battle she fought in silence. The years went by, and the boy grew up surrounded by his mother's love and his father's discipline. He was a curious child, with large, bright eyes that always seemed to seek something beyond the horizon. Rosora told him stories every night, tales she invented to give him a world larger than the small town where they lived. Ezequiel listened intently, his little fingers playing with the folds of his mother's dress as she spoke of distant lands and cities full of lights. When Ezequiel turned 7, he began to accompany Jacinto to the fields. The woman watched from the window as her son, wearing a hat far too big for his head, tried to imitate his father's movements. Though she knew it was tradition, something in her heart resisted the idea of her son following the same path that had trapped Jacinto and his family. One afternoon, while her husband was in the fields, she took her son's hand and led him to the small corner where she kept the books and magazines she had managed to collect over the years. "There are more things in the world than this town," she told him, pointing to a picture of a city with skyscrapers. "One day, you can go and discover them for yourself." Ezequiel looked at her with a mix of excitement and confusion. "Do you think I can?" he asked, with an innocence that made Rosa feel a lump in her throat. "Of course you can," she replied, squeezing his small hand. You are capable of everything." And so it was, when Ezequiel turned 15. The same age Rosora had been when she married, the young man made the decision to leave the town. "I want to go to the capital, Mama," he told her one afternoon, with a determination she recognized instantly. Jacinto did not agree, but Ezequiel insisted, and the woman knew she could not stop him. Though her heart broke at the thought of the distance, she also felt pride. She had achieved what she promised herself that night in the storm, to give her son the chance to dream. The farewell was brief and painful. Rosora shed no tears in front of him, but when the truck carrying him to the city disappeared on the horizon, she felt an emptiness she could not fill. She remained in the yard, gazing at the mountains that had always been there, silent witnesses to her life. "Fly high, son," she whispered to the wind, with a mix of pride and sadness. The house grew silent after Ezequiel's departure. The woman felt his absence as a constant weight on her chest. The sun still rose over the same mountains, the tortillas puffed up on the griddle as always, and her husband returned from the fields with the same dust covering his boots. But something had changed. The yard, which once echoed with Ezequiel's laughter and curious questions, now seemed an empty place. Jacinto, though he never admitted it aloud, also felt his son's departure. He had spent weeks resisting the idea, arguing with Rosora every time the subject came up. "Young people have no business going so far away," he repeated harshly. But in the end, his will had yielded to Ezequiel's determination, and now he took refuge in his work so as not to think too much about the emptiness that had been left behind. The woman, for her part, spent the night sitting by the window, gazing at the stars and wondering how her son was doing in the capital. The letters Ezequiel sent her were her only comfort. In them, he described with enthusiasm the tall buildings, the streets full of lights, and the people who always seemed to be in a hurry. Rosora read those letters over and over, imagining her son walking through those streets she could only dream of. Time passed, and with it, routine began once again to fill life. Jacinto kept working in the fields, increasingly tired, while she cared for the house with the same dedication as always. However, one afternoon, everything changed. The man returned earlier than usual, his face pale and his hands trembling. "My chest hurts," he said, leaning against the door. Rosora ran to hold him, her heart racing. Jacinto, who had always been a strong, resilient man, now seemed fragile. That night, the woman sat by his side while he rested in bed. Though they had never openly discussed it, both knew what was happening. Time was catching up with Jacinto, and the health he had taken for granted for years was now exacting its price. The man began to miss the fields more often, and she took on caring for him as she had cared for so many others throughout her life. Though they had never been a deeply loving couple, she felt an unexpected tenderness toward him in those moments. He was the man who had shared her life, with all his imperfections and limitations. One afternoon, while she served him a hot broth, Jacinto broke the silence that had lingered between them for days. "I wasn't a good husband to you," he said in a weak voice, staring at the floor. She looked at him, surprised by his words. Her husband had never been a man of deep reflections. "You did what you knew how to do," she replied after a moment, in a tone more resigned than forgiving. "No," he insisted, raising his gaze to meet Rosora's. "You deserved more. I know it, but I never knew how to give it to you." The woman did not respond. She didn't know what to say. Deep down, she had long accepted that her life would not be the one she had dreamed of. But hearing Jacinto acknowledge it was like reopening an old wound that had never fully healed. The man's health declined rapidly, and one dawn, with her sitting by his side, he exhaled his last breath. Rosora remained still, her hands clasped on her lap. She did not cry right away. Jacinto's death did not take her by surprise. In many ways, she had already made her peace with his departure. However, when the sunrise began to stain the sky, the tears came suddenly, like rain that had been held back for years. The house felt emptier than ever. Rosora, now alone, spent her days gathering and organizing Jacinto's things, as if by doing so, she might find some way to close that chapter of her life. The neighbors visited her from time to time, bringing food or company, but she knew that solitude was something she would have to learn to live with. One afternoon, while cleaning an old wooden box, she found a packet of letters. They weren't from Ezequiel, but from Jacinto, who had kept receipts and papers in that corner for years. Among them, she found something she did not expect, a folded sheet of paper with her name written in the corner. "Rosora," the note began, in her husband's rough handwriting. "I always knew you deserved more. I never told you, but I thank you for having been by my side, for having cared for me and for our son. You are the strongest woman I know. I hope that one day you find the happiness I always denied you." Rosora's hands trembled as she held the letter. It was not a declaration of love, nor a perfect apology. But those words, simple and honest, struck her with a force she had not expected. For the first time, she allowed herself to think that, despite everything, Jacinto had tried to understand her, even if only at the end. Weeks later, the woman received an unexpected letter. "Mariela and I are expecting a baby, Mama," the paper said. A simple message, but one that filled Rosaura's heart with a mix of emotions, joy, pride, and also a slight sadness. Her son was building his life far from her, but at least he was fulfilling the dreams she had never been able to reach. "I promise I will visit you soon, Mama. I want you to meet your grandchild." Read the last line of the letter. That night, Rosaura sat in the yard, gazing at the stars. The mountains were still there, immovable, but for the first time in a long while, she felt that the future carried with it a spark of hope. The days stretched out for the woman as she awaited news from her son. The promise of meeting her grandchild gave her a new purpose, something she had not felt in a long time. The mornings began to fill with small but meaningful tasks, weaving blankets of soft wool, preparing the empty little room for visitors, and checking the clock with obsessive frequency, wondering if that would be the day the long-awaited message arrived. The day finally came. The letter, written in Ezekiel's same hurried handwriting, described how Mariela, his wife, had given birth to a healthy boy they named Mateo. Rosaura stared at the paper for long minutes, letting the news sink in. A solitary tear rolled down her cheek, but this time it was not of sadness. She had waited so long for this moment that she had almost feared it would never come. Her son kept his promise months later, bringing Mariela and little Mateo with him. Rosaura waited at the door when she saw her son appear along the dirt road, the baby wrapped in a blanket and his wife at his side. The woman could barely contain her emotion as Ezekiel approached with a wide smile. "Mama, this is Mateo," her son said, placing the baby in her arms. Rosaura looked at him carefully, with an almost reverent tremor in her hands. Mateo's dark eyes, small and curious, reminded her of Ezekiel when he was a baby. "Hello, my little one," she whispered, caressing his cheek. During the days that followed, the house was once again filled with life. Mateo, with his laughter and cries, brought renewed energy to the home. Mariela, sweet and attentive, helped Rosaura with the household chores, while Ezekiel told her stories about life in the capital. Rosaura, however, could not help but feel a persistent fear deep in her heart. She knew this moment of happiness was temporary, a pause before distance would separate them again. But as she held Mateo in her arms, as she listened to Ezekiel laugh with Mariela, she decided she would not think about the future. She wanted to enjoy every second she had with them. One night, while she was sitting in the yard, her son joined her with a cup of hot coffee. For a moment, they both remained silent, gazing at the stars. "Thank you for everything you did for me, Mama," Ezekiel said suddenly, breaking the silence. "If it weren't for you, I wouldn't have been able to dream of something more." Rosaura looked at him, surprised by his words. "I only did what a mother must do," she replied, with a humility that concealed the magnitude of the sacrifices she had made. "No, Mama, you did much more. You taught me not to settle, to look for something beyond this place. That's why I can give Mateo a better future." The woman did not respond right away. In her heart, she felt a mixture of pride and sadness. She had managed to give her son a better life, but at the cost of being left alone. Yet, when she looked at Ezekiel, she knew it had been worth it. When the time came to say goodbye, the woman prepared for their departure with a strength she could barely hold on to. She held Mateo one last time, memorizing every detail of his small face, before handing him to Mariela. "I promise we'll be back soon," Ezekiel said, hugging her tightly. Rosaura nodded, not trusting her voice to answer. She watched from the doorway as they left, the carriage carrying them back to the capital. When the dust of the road finally settled, the woman was left alone in the yard, with the mountains as her only company. In the months that followed, she dedicated her days to sewing blankets and sending letters with advice on how to care for Matteo. Her connection with Ezekiel remained alive through the words they shared on paper. But as Matteo grew, Rosaura noticed that her son's replies became shorter and less frequent. The modern world, with its responsibilities and distractions, was beginning to pull her son and grandson away. Matteo, who had once been a baby in her arms, was now a child full of energy and his own dreams. Though Rosaura understood that time passed, she could not help but feel she was being forgotten. When Matteo turned 8, Rosaura received a phone call from Ezekiel. The woman was still amazed by that new device that allowed her to hear her son's warm voice. "Matteo wants to come see you, Mama, but he won't be able to stay long. School, you know," Ezekiel explained. The woman pretended to be fine, but she hung up the phone with her heart tight. Time was passing too quickly, and she barely saw them. When her grandson arrived at the village that time, he was no longer the small child she had known. Now he was a curious young boy, fascinated with electronic devices and the stories of the city. Though he was affectionate with her, Rosaura noticed that his attention was always elsewhere. "Grandma, why did you never leave the village?" Matteo asked one afternoon as they both sat under the guava tree. The woman didn't know how to answer. She looked at the mountains on the horizon, the same ones that had defined her life, and smiled sadly. "Because this was always my home," she finally said. The boy didn't insist, but in his expression, Rosaura could see that he didn't fully understand. Matteo's generation wasn't made to accept limits. And though that filled the woman with pride, it also made her feel more alone. That night, as she knitted in her room, she heard Matteo laughing as he spoke with Mariella on the phone about the city. She knew then that, just like Ezekiel, her grandson would also follow a path far from her. "It's the right thing," she told herself, remembering the words she had once whispered to Ezekiel. "Fly high." She enjoyed her grandson's company as much as she could, but soon she was left alone again. The years passed, submerged in routine and nostalgia. Ezekiel called from time to time, but their conversations were brief and practical. They talked about Matteo, about how he was doing at school, about the plans he had. Rosaura nodded, listening attentively. But every word reinforced the feeling that her grandson lived in a world completely different from her own. "I'll visit you soon, Mama," her son always said before hanging up, but she knew that soon was nothing more than a distant promise, lost in the city's routine. When Matteo turned 17, the woman had already resigned herself to not seeing him again. Her old bones barely allowed her to get out of bed and do the chores as before. The only comfort she had were her grandson's calls and the photos he sometimes sent by mail. That morning she woke up early, as always. As soon as she got up, she felt an intense pain in her back, one she had lived with for some time. She thought of going back to bed. But she was not a woman who could stay still easily. So she got up and went out to the yard to collect chicken eggs for breakfast. However, something different caught her attention. There, hanging from the clothesline, was a brightly colored piñata, swaying gently in the wind. The woman dropped the basket she was carrying in her hands. The piñata was shaped like a star, with long red, blue, and yellow paper rays that seemed to shine under the sun. It was impossible not to remember that piñata, which, many years ago, her father had mercilessly burned. She approached with slow steps, as if fearing that object might disappear at any moment. Her rough fingers touched the delicate paper, and a knot formed in her throat. Looking closer, she noticed a small envelope attached to one of the rays. She carefully detached it and opened the letter inside. "Dear Grandma, I can't always be close, but I never stop thinking of you. Dad told me about your childhood and how you never had a piñata. I want you to have this one, as a reminder that your love and sacrifices have made our family what it is today. Thank you for teaching us to dream. I love you, Matteo." Tears began to roll down her cheeks as she reread her grandson's words again and again. That gesture, so simple and sincere, was an answer to the emptiness she had felt for so long. Though distance separated them, she knew she had not been forgotten. With a small smile, she took a wooden stick and broke the piñata, as if wanting to release all the emotions she had held back for years. The candies, toys, and sweets fell to the ground, and among them, she found something that surprised her even more. A photograph. In the image, taken during Matteo's last visit, she and her grandson appeared embraced under the guava tree. Rosaura held a small bouquet of flowers, while Matteo smiled broadly. The photo, carefully framed, was a gift that seemed to tell her that her love had not been in vain. That night, as she looked at the photograph in her room, the woman felt something new. Her life, marked by sacrifices and deprivations, had borne fruit that could not be measured in possessions or wealth, but in love and in the freedom she had managed to give her own. 5 years had passed since her grandson had given her that piñata. That simple yet meaningful gesture had given her back something she thought was lost. The connection with her family, the certainty that her love was still alive despite the distance. Since then, her grandson's calls became more frequent, and, though visits remained scarce, each encounter felt like a celebration. However, with the passing of age, the woman was no longer the same. The days had grown heavier. Though she still took care of her chores, her body was beginning to fail her. Each dawn was a challenge for her tired bones, but the thought of receiving another call from Matteo or a letter from Ezekiel kept her moving. The small altar she had created in her room, with photographs of her son, her grandson, and that framed image under the guava tree, was her emotional refuge. The woman expected nothing special for her birthday. Celebrations had never been an important part of her life, except when Matteo was a child running through the yard with laughter that filled the air. However, that afternoon, something different happened. The sound of an engine broke the calm of the village. Rosaura, sitting under the guava tree, lifted her gaze toward the road. In the distance, a car approached, raising dust behind it. Though her eyesight was not what it had been, it didn't take long to recognize the figure of her son getting out of the vehicle. Behind him, her grandson descended with an enthusiasm that made her smile instantly. Ezekiel walked toward her, with Mariella at his side and a bouquet of flowers in his hands. Matteo followed his father, carrying a small box that seemed to contain something special. "Grandma!" the young man shouted with a wide smile, hurrying to embrace her. "Happy birthday! Happy birthday!" Rosaura stood by the guava tree, leaning on the trunk as her eyes filled with tears. She received her grandson's hug with an affection that only time could strengthen. "Ezekiel, Mariella," she said with a trembling voice as she opened her arms to them, "I wasn't expecting to see you today." "How could we miss your birthday, Mama?" her son replied, handing her the flowers. "We knew we had to be with you today." Mariella stepped forward to kiss her on the cheek. "Happy birthday, Doña Rosaura. Today is your day, and we won't accept excuses. We're going to celebrate it properly." The afternoon passed with laughter and memories. The woman couldn't remember the last time she had her whole family gathered under the guava tree. While Matteo helped set the table in the yard, Mariella prepared the food in the kitchen, and Ezekiel sat next to his mother, talking with a warmth that had been rare in recent years. "Mama, do you remember when Matteo was little and tried to catch the hens in the yard? They ended up chasing him instead," said Ezekiel, laughing. "Of course I remember," she replied, smiling at the memory of her grandson running with a hat far too big for his head. "He never stopped making me laugh." Matteo, who was listening to the conversation from the table, looked up with an embarrassed smile. "Well, Grandma, now I have something better than hens to introduce to you." Everyone's attention turned to the young man, who came closer to his grandmother, nervous but excited. "I wanted to tell you something. I met someone. Her name is Lucia. She's amazing. Grandma, she really is. We met at university, and, well, I want to introduce her to you soon. Rosora looked at him tenderly, taking his hands in hers. Matteo, that makes me very happy. I want to meet her. If she's important to you, then she will be important to me. The young man nodded, relieved by his grandmother's answer. Thank you, Grandma. I know she'll love you. Later, while everyone enjoyed the food Mariella had prepared, Ezekiel cleared his throat slightly to get his mother's attention. There's something else I want to tell you today, he began, in a tone Rosara immediately recognized as the start of something important. I've been thinking a lot about you, about how you've spent so much time alone here in the village, and I think it's time for that to change. The woman looked at him with curiosity, setting her glass of water down on the table. What do you mean, son? I want you to come live with me in the capital, Ezekiel said, direct but gentle. I don't want you to stay here alone anymore. You've done enough. It's time for you to think about yourself, Mama. You could see the city, travel, enjoy things you never had the chance to do. We're finally doing well financially. We can buy a house for you, or you can live with us. Whatever you want. But come. Her son's words fell on the woman like an unexpected blow. The idea of leaving the village, her home, the guava tree that had been her refuge for so many years, was difficult to imagine. Ezekiel, I don't know, she murmured, turning her gaze toward the mountains that surrounded her home. Matteo took his grandmother's hand. Grandma, I want you to come too. You could see what life is like there, meet Lucia, and be with us. You don't have to decide now, but think about it. We all want you close. Rosora looked at them both, feeling her heart torn between the nostalgia of the familiar and the possibility of something new. I don't want to be a burden to you, she said finally, her voice trembling. Burden? Ezekiel replied, taking her other hand. Mama, you could never be a burden. If it weren't for you, neither Matteo nor I would be who we are today. We want you with us, because you deserve it. That night, after the conversation had calmed and the family began clearing the dishes, the woman stayed a moment alone under the guava tree. She looked toward the mountains, which her whole life had been both a barrier and a symbol of her strength. The idea of leaving the village was terrifying, but she also felt a spark of curiosity. What if she really could start anew? What if, even at 85, there was still something to look forward to? When her grandson came over to say goodnight before going to sleep, Rosaura stopped him for a moment. Matteo, do you think I could really adapt to a different life? Of course you can, Grandma. You're stronger than you think, and no matter where you are, you'll always have a home with us. The woman smiled, hugging him tightly. Thank you, son. As the night went on, she made her decision. She didn't know what her life would be like away from the village, but she was ready to try. For the first time, the mountains no longer seemed like a prison. They seemed like a bridge to something new. All right, she murmured to herself, gazing at the stars. It's time to fly high. And so, dear friends, we come to the end of this sad story. I hope you enjoyed listening to it. Don't forget to subscribe and give it a like so I can keep bringing you stories of kindness, love, gratitude, and hope. Leave me a comment if you liked it and let me know where you're listening from so I can send you a little heart. Sending you a hug and see you in the next story.